In the fall of 2001, a small white aircraft lifted off from a marsh in central Wisconsin, and 8 young whooping cranes rose into the air behind it, wings beating in formation with a machine that had spent months teaching them it was safe to follow. Over the next several weeks, that aircraft would lead those 8 birds on a journey of more than 1,000 miles to Florida, the first of what would become 14 consecutive years of humans literally flying young birds south by hand. What drove wildlife biologists to attempt something this strange traces back to a single number recorded 60 years earlier. And what that 14-year experiment actually proved is far more complicated than the viral footage of birds following an airplane ever let on. Every claim in this video is drawn from official records of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and U.S. Geological Survey, published population surveys from the International Crane Foundation, and peer-reviewed research from the North American Crane Working Group. This is not the simplified version of the whooping crane story. This is what the actual 8 decades of data show. To understand why anyone would strap into an ultralight aircraft and try to teach a bird to migrate, you first have to understand exactly how close this species came to disappearing completely. Whooping cranes had likely never been common. Even before European settlement, biologists estimate the total population across North America may have only ranged between 500 and 1,400 birds. Hunting and the conversion of prairie wetlands into farmland pushed that number steadily downward through the 19th and early 20th centuries. Protections came in pieces. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act passed in 1916. Canada established Wood Buffalo National Park in 1922, though no one yet knew it held nesting cranes. Texas established Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in 1937, specifically as a wintering sanctuary. None of it was fast enough. By 1941, the last self-sustaining migratory flock of whooping cranes on the planet had fallen to just 15 birds. Every whooping crane alive today, in the wild or in captivity, is a descendant of that single surviving flock. The recovery that followed took decades to gain real traction. Conservationists spent years searching for where the last cranes actually nested before finally locating the breeding grounds deep inside Wood Buffalo National Park in 1954, accessible only by helicopter. In 1966, biologists at the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center began a captive breeding program, collecting eggs from wild nests to raise chicks under human care. The species was formally listed as endangered in 1970. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, researchers tried releasing young whooping cranes into flocks of sandhill cranes, hoping the sandhills would teach them to migrate as adopted parents. It didn't work the way anyone hoped. The whooping cranes learned the migration route just fine, but they imprinted so completely on their sandhill foster parents that as adults they tried to court and pair with sandhill cranes instead of their own species. An entire generation of reintroduced birds effectively failed to reproduce. That failure is what eventually led to the idea that sounds almost too strange to be real. If young cranes needed to learn a migration route from a parent, and using foster birds of the wrong species created lasting behavioral damage, what if the thing teaching them to fly wasn't a bird at all, but something that couldn't imprint them onto anything except the migration path itself? Conservationists, including Bill Lishman and Joe Duff, had already proven the basic concept was possible, having successfully led Canada geese on migration behind an ultralight aircraft years earlier. In 2001, that same technique was applied to whooping cranes for the first time under a new coalition called the Whooping Crane Eastern Partnership, bringing together federal wildlife agencies, state agencies, and conservation nonprofits, including what became Operation Migration. The process itself was almost absurdly meticulous. Chicks hatched at Patuxent were raised from their first days of life by handlers wearing full white crane costumes, using a puppet shaped like an adult crane's head to feed them, specifically so the chicks would never see or bond with a human face or hand. The young birds were moved to White River Marsh in Wisconsin, where costumed handlers walked them alongside a taxiing ultralight aircraft for weeks, then flew short training loops with them, gradually building the birds' stamina and trust in the machine as something safe to follow. Each fall, once the young cranes were strong enough, the actual migration began. A real ultralight aircraft, painted white, guiding a small cohort of juvenile cranes on a route of roughly 1,285 miles from Wisconsin to the Gulf Coast of Florida, flown in short hops over a period of weeks, sometimes grounded for days at a time by weather. The idea was that birds only needed to learn the route once. After that first guided flight, Cranes are capable of migrating on their own in future years, the same way wild-hatched birds do. Cohort by cohort, the numbers built. 8 birds in 2001, more each following year. Over 14 consecutive migrations, Operation Migration and its partners led young whooping cranes south by aircraft every single autumn from 2001 through 2015, establishing what became known as the Eastern Migratory Population, cranes that split their year between Wisconsin and Florida on a corridor the species had not used in living memory. Meanwhile, the original wild flock kept climbing too, crossing 100 birds for the first time in the winter of 1986 and 1987. A milestone that had once seemed almost unimaginable for a species that stood at 15. But here is the part that the heartwarming footage of birds following an airplane never quite explains. In 2015, Operation Migration's Ultralight program came to an end, and not because it had succeeded in the way everyone had hoped. Researchers comparing outcomes across the different release methods used in the eastern migratory population found no statistically significant difference in 1-year or 3-year survival between ultralight-led birds and those released using a simpler, far cheaper method called direct autumn release, where young cranes are simply paired with older, experienced wild birds who lead them south the normal way. If a low-tech method worked just as well as an aircraft that had to be built, flown, and maintained across a 1,000-mile route for months at a time, the economics of the ultralight approach became very hard to justify. And that wasn't even the deeper problem. The real crisis was reproduction. For years, whooping cranes reintroduced into Wisconsin kept abandoning their nests before eggs could hatch, and researchers eventually traced much of the blame to biting black flies that swarm Wisconsin wetlands at exactly the time cranes are incubating eggs each spring, harassing adult birds off their nests before chicks ever had a chance. The result was a population that could be built through captive breeding and careful release, but struggled for years to sustain itself the way a truly wild, self-renewing population should, which raises a fair question. If a reintroduced population still depends this heavily on humans raising and releasing new birds every year just to hold steady, has it actually recovered? Or is it something closer to a permanently supported population that looks wild from a distance but isn't quite standing on its own yet? What the data shows today is a genuinely split picture. The original wild flock, the one descended from those 15 survivors, has now spent roughly a decade holding above 500 birds, with the most recent federal aerial survey estimating around 540 whooping cranes wintering near Aranza, a real and substantial recovery by any measure. The eastern migratory population tells a very different story. Even now, a decade after the ultralight program ended, that population sits at only around 65 to 70 birds, and in recent survey counts, only 15 or 16 of those individuals were actually wild hatched, meaning the rest are still captive, reared, and released, not born and raised entirely in the wild. Add in the smaller non-migratory flocks living year-round in Louisiana and Florida, and the total number of whooping cranes on the planet today, wild and captive combined, sits at roughly 600, a species still formally listed as endangered, though recently under consideration for a downgrade to threatened status as recovery efforts continue. More than 80 years after that flock bottomed out at 15 birds, the whooping crane story isn't a single clean turnaround, and it was never going to be. It's one wild population that genuinely rebuilt itself once the killing stopped and the habitat held, sitting alongside a second, newer population that humans are, in a very real sense, still carrying. Maybe that's the more honest way to think about recovery stories like this one. Success isn't always the moment a species stops needing help. Sometimes it's just the slow, expensive, unglamorous work of making sure it's still here at all, whether that means the flies finally lose, the fostering finally sticks, or another aircraft has to take off one more September.